We are live here on Plus One EXP's Roll for Content channel. My name is Tony Vicinda. I'm Chief Alchemist here at Plus One EXP. We're a weird little brand that multi-classes in tabletop game design, beard and skincare alchemy, and the Bardic College of Content Creation. Our hope and desire is to help amazing designers find great players who love their games and help amazing players find great designers whose games they can love. We do that in a lot of different ways. Because we play a lot of games with designers, one of our things that we love to do is to sit down and talk with different members of the community about different topics. A little while ago, Jack, who you're going to meet in just one second, had just kind of tweeted out, would anybody be interested in hosting a panel on horror RPG creation? And I love hosting community conversations, so I said we'd love to have a bunch of folks on stream. So we pulled together a great crew of folks from across the globe. We've got multiple continents and a ton of time zones represented in the conversation today. And we all managed to show up at the same place at the same time to make this happen for y'all. So I'm super excited about this conversation. It is a live conversation. We've got a couple questions to get us started, but if you're out there watching us live and you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat wherever you're watching. We should be able to bring them up on stream also too. But with that said, let's go ahead and meet our illustrious crew of panelists. We're going to start with right below me as the viewer sees us, and that's going to be with Sam Mui. Sam, do you want to tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online, but also tell me what scares you? What are you afraid of?
All right. So, hi, my name is Sam. I am a RPG game designer and coder and musician and artist from Malaysia. And you can find me on Twitter and itch.io at BubblegumSam. I am currently copy editing, as we speak, I'm copy editing my latest Halloween release called Horse Girl, which is a game about a young woman who consents to be surgically and mentally transformed into a horse by her lover. And that's what the game is about. Let's see, what else about me? What scares me? I have not been scared for a long time. I think it's just how my brain has reacted to real life bullshit. But let me think. I guess control and manipulation. Yeah, that's quite scary. But that you don't need ghosts and vampires for that. You just need people for that. I think that scares me. Yeah.
Awesome, love it. Let's keep on working our way across the screen. We're going to go over to Chris Bissett. Chris, tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online. Tell us a little bit about what scares you, but then I'll have another follow-up question for you.
Oh, God. Hi, I'm Chris Bissett. I run Loot the Room, and I'm a musician and writer and all-around games person thing. I don't know what I do most days. I just exist. You can find me on Twitter at Pangalactic, Loot the Room. I'm on Kickstarter at the moment. And what scares me? My own brain breaking on a daily basis is the most terrifying thing in the world to me, I think.
Awesome. Not awesome. I hope that does. but an excellent answer. Tell us a little bit also about the game that you've got going right now over on Kickstarter, which is not a horror game as far as I know.
No, not yet anyway. It's solo. I grew up playing fighting fantasy adventures, and the last couple of years I got really into Troika, which is a hack of advanced fighting fantasy, or a retro clone of advanced fighting fantasy. And so I thought the best thing for Troika would be to take it back to its roots and write a choose-your-own-adventure style branching narratives novel set in Troika. So I'm writing a book called Down in Yongadi, where you play a newly qualified Yongadi lawyer who kills someone they absolutely should not have killed and goes on the run. And we're going to be funding that for the next month. So that's what scares me the most right now, actually, Kickstarter.
Love it. It's absolutely gorgeous. I love all the different things you did. I'm a huge fan of your work, and so I'm super about this project, and was have been excited about it for a long time because you announced it, then had another very cool project, and then now are back to it. So I can't wait. I got to hop over and back it also too, but it has funded, so congratulations on that. But if folks want to go check it out, they can and should. Links are in the chat down below for everybody. Awesome. Let's hop over to Jack. Jack, tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online, and also tell us a little bit about what scares you.
Yeah, cool. So, hi, I'm Jack. I'm one half of Cobblepath, technically the lead designer of Cobblepath. The other half, Steph, is the lead writer. She does more writing, I do more design. We're fairly new. The main thing we've done is we made Locust, and I'm going to be cheeky and hold up the books because I have them right here. And most of the stuff we've done so far has been making stuff for that, and that's our horror game. Otherwise, I used to teach game design. Now I'm technically doing this full time. Well, I'm trying to. You can find me on Twitter at Cobblesprite or Cobblepath, and cobblepathgames.co.uk as well is our website. Otherwise, what scares me? Well, the cheap media answer is ghosts. Like, give me a ghost story. I find them far scarier than pretty much anything else. The more meta answer is my own mistakes, which is kind of like what Locust was built around, not specifically my mistakes, but playing on people's mistakes as a source of horror. So yeah, there you go.
Awesome. Love it. Let's hop up to Philip. Philip, tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online, and also what scares you.
Well, I'm Philip Launcher. I'm a creation tabletop designer. Normally, I'm a systems engineer and systems architect. You can find me on both itch.io and on Twitter under Ordo Ala Publishing. And as a side thing, I actually study publishing, as in physical offset book printing. And what scares me the most is actually thalassophobia. I've got really unexplainable fear of deep, deep dark water. So,
interesting. Awesome. Thanks for the answer, and looking forward to chatting with you more today. Last but not least, we've got Wendy. You're going to see a lot of Wendy on stream this month. I'm super excited to get to hang out with her a couple times. Wendy, tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online, and what scares you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Wendy. I'm a writer, mostly from Brazil. I am trans, and as Susan Stryker would say, that makes me a monster. And therefore, what scares me, apart from spiders, because I have huge arachnophobia, what scares me the most is how people react or can react to their fear of me.
Oh, man, what a great answer. We have you on a couple times this month. We're going to talk about a couple projects you've done for Exalted Funeral later in the month, play some games. But I do want to ask you real quick, there is another project that is also live right now, and that is the LatAm Breakout by Soul Muppet Publications. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you're doing with the project?
Yeah, so LatAm Breakout is a huge opportunity for Latin American designers. Actually, Sam is my editor in my game called Here, There, Be Monsters, with the commas and the exclamation point, where I'm dealing exactly with what I said right now, monstrosity. It's not a horror game per se, but it takes the tropes that permeate horror related to monstrosity and makes you the monsters and something to be cherished and protected and not hunted as monster hunting would go.
Awesome. I can't wait to check it out. There's a ton of great contributors on the project. I'm very, very excited. We're huge fans of the RPG Latin American community, and we're super excited to see other folks taking such a great interest in investing in the community also, too, because it's one of our favorite communities to be able to collaborate and work with also, too. And so I'm super excited to check out all the different parts of that project. But We didn't come here today to talk about all the amazing Kickstarter projects that y'all are running. We came here to talk specifically about horror RPGs, answer some questions, talk about things. There's been a good amount of ones and zeros spilled over what makes a horror RPG successful, about what kind of mechanics support horror RPGs, about whether system matters, unfortunately, one way or the other. And I kind of want to just start out talking a little bit about some of the very broad parts of that, maybe kind of narrow in on some of the different things. We talk a lot, like I think horror is a very interesting genre because it's not necessarily about just having scary things. It's about tone and a lot of other pieces. But I just want to toss out to y'all, what makes something a horror game in your opinion? Like, is there a line that you draw? Is it a way that it's written, or is it just simply the statement, we wrote this as a horror game? I'd love to hear some thoughts and ideas about that. I'm gonna, I think, pop over to Jack first, and then we'll kind of go from there, unless somebody else really wants to take this one off the bat. But Jack, why don't you give us some opening ideas, and then we'll pop over to somebody else.
Well, the sort of cheap basic answer of what makes something a horror game is it about horror, really? Like, is the game about horror? What horror means to you or the creators is a pretty nebulous thing, but was it made to be about horror is kind of where my thing falls. You can do horror in lots of games, but for a game to be a horror game, it should be about that horror. And that should be like a central part of the game, which I think is a hopefully relatively uncontroversial take, and also probably just a bit of a flat, boring statement really for it. But I mean, that's kind of where I sit with it, and I think that the effectiveness of that is the really thorny, terrifying part of it all.
Awesome. Anyone else want to pick up on that or have any other ideas about kind of what makes something a horror game specifically?
Yeah, if nobody's going to do it, now I'll do it. Right. I would have to say that horror is mainly about power play. It's always power play. The only question is if you're giving it willingly or if it's taken away. If you're giving it willingly, it's not exactly horror, but if it's taken away from you, if you do not have that feeling of control of yourself, that's horror. That's the actual part of horror. Now, the issue is, do we give this freely or do we take it away from the players? But if you take it away from the players, is it enjoyable? That's the issue.
Yeah, so there are these dynamics of power that come into play and how that specifically evolves within the play state, like being something that in a healthy way potentially is where a lot of the design elements of horror come in, and where a lot of the specific ways that your play culture at your table are going to kind of impact that. I love that. Chris, what's the scariest mechanic of all the mechanics?
I knew you were going to ask me that. There's no such thing as a scary mechanic, and we all know that's what I'm going to say.
I do want to say
right.
that this is a common question that will come up, and I did say that I was going to 100% ask you this
You
question
did.
because I want to hear the rant. But this is not an uncommon question. Go ahead.
Like, I firmly believe that mechanics don't make horror and fear. Players and play makes horror and fear. Like, I could run you through a game of Mothership right now that engaged with only the mechanics and no fiction, and it would be the most boring, unscary thing we've ever done. Nobody's ever been scared just playing a game of Jenga. It's not mechanics that make fear and horror, it's players and stories that make fear and horror. And you can turn any game into a horror game just through play.
Awesome. And we are going to talk about...
I'm going to say
go ahead.
that the scariest mechanics for me is Pathfinder because of all the numbers. They're really scary.
Second edition, but
mechanic
second
is math.
edition.
Math is the scariest mechanic of them all. And so it was math the whole time. No, I love it. No, and I think this is a huge part of the conversation because there still are ways that we use mechanics to suggest the ways that we build tension. So I think an actual helpful way to actually have the conversation around mechanics and mechanics that you might include in our game is actually to look at some specific examples, maybe from y'all or from games that you've enjoyed that help support that mindset a whole lot? Like, how do we actually, what tools do we give people, whether that's mechanic or whether that's part of a safety toolkit or whether that's even just narrative encouragement? What are some of the things that you do when you're designing specifically that help people engage more in that horror mindset? Because I think that's actually the helpful place to have that conversation when we're talking about design specifically. So let's talk to Sam a little bit. Sam, when you're designing a horror game or you encourage people to engage in a play around horror, what's a mechanic you've used or you've seen be used really effectively to help do that?
So I think for the most part, I don't think it's possible. Okay, I think on the mechanics level, it's not really possible to design a horror game. Because I think as Chris was saying, it's not, if you're talking about numbers or like dice rolling, they're not really gonna like enhance the horror experience. I think, in my opinion, to me, the best horror game is still Cthulhu Dark, and it's just 3 dice, 3d6s, and a whole lot of support for telling a story, for framing things, for like showing your descent into, well, yeah, it does use sanity, but you can easily replace it with something else. Yeah, it's basically about framing, right? And I do agree that when it comes to designing any game, what you should be thinking about is framing, regardless of mechanics. You can run a game with no mechanics. You can design and publish a full game with no mechanics. But the framing itself is a mechanic. Getting players to agree to buy into horror, to buy into to be scared, to explore this uncomfortable topic. That is in a sense like a different kind of, mechanic design. Yes. Hi. Yes, Jack.
Counterpoint. I mean, I agree with the sentiment of your statements. I disagree with some of the specifics. But the counterpoint is that, framing is the all-powerful thing, but the combination of mechanics is framing. Like, mechanics make framing as much as framing influences mechanics. More importantly, the combination, the aggregate effect of a game's whole mechanics creates the framing. Like, I completely agree, in isolation, mechanics will not be scary. But I do think that certain mechanics do engage with that kind of gameplay and encourage people to engage with games in certain ways, and that certain ones can do the opposite effect. I do think that there are ways to design for horror. I mean, I'd be a massive hypocrite if I suggested that I did think otherwise, since I wrote a whole game on literally that entire premise. I mean, it's cool if you think I failed, because legit. But
Same feeling here.
I do think that mechanics can be built for horror. I do think you can mechanically build for horror, and I do think that you can have mechanics that encourage a horror mindset and a horror like setup and framework.
So Jack, give us an example of that in your own design, or that you think is particularly effective in somebody else's.
Okay, so one thing that we did was a really simple one. It's really cheap, honestly. Like, it's super simple, but you don't the attributes in Locus are not positive; they're negative. And again, like, some people might define that more as framing than mechanics, but it does affect how the dice rolls work and stuff. So you don't have strength in Locus; you have frailty. You don't have intelligence or knowledge or whatever; you have ignorance. It does a few things. One is that it gets people in that sort of like negative mindset when they're making characters. It makes them think about like the potential failings of characters more than what they're really good at, and avoids that sort of like superhero, like power fantasy thing. But the other thing it does is it also means that whenever you're doing checks, you're kind of like battling against your character in a way.
So do you think that horror is inherently a genre about negativity and bad people?
Sorry, was that a question or?
Yeah, it's a question.
No, I don't think it is. I think a lot of the most interesting horror is about good people trying to be good in bad situations. But I think that if you take a lot of horror tropes, in a lot of horror stories, characters don't succeed because of what they're good at. They fail because of what they're bad at, which is kind of what we were trying to capture with that stat spread. Also, like Locus is kind of based around the idea that every character has done something bad that haunts them, so it kind of like ties in thematically as a through line for the whole system. I don't think it's, you know, the only way to do it, but it's something we did. It did come from that sort of like idea though that characters tend to fail because of what they're bad at in horror stories, rather than succeed because of what they're good at. You do have things you're good at in it, and ways to play about that, but it's kind of like about the framing of the core attributes of the characters.
Awesome. We're going to pop up to Wendy in just 1 second, but Frankie just made a comment in the chat that I think is really good. For what it's worth, I think a lot of powerlessness is derived from trying something you are proficient at and failing regardless. It's a really excellent mode of telegraphing, and it goes back to what Philip was talking about earlier about those power plays and about. It's a really great thought. Wendy, you had something you wanted to say though?
Yeah, and I think it's perfect that Frankie chimed in on chat, because that question is basically exactly what me and Frankie are trying to tackle in our next game. Right after Latin Breakout, we're working on a game called Exquisite Umbras, and it's a really horror game this time, because horror is my favorite genre of all, but I don't usually get scared by horror, right? I think there's, going back to the first question, I think there's two ways you can deal with horror. First, as a genre, and genre not as a tag or a definition for labeling your books or stuff, but as a set of expectations and mostly unsaid agreements of how to go on together. But horror can also be an affect in in as in something that affects you, something that makes you feel horrified or disgusted or scared. But those two are not mutually exclusive, but they're certainly not the same. So what I think is the mechanics in all kinds of genres, just like tropes in fiction. And I'm a screenwriter first, and the same thing. Screenwriting rules, they are not laws. They're tools for writing your story efficiently. I think the same thing goes for mechanics. They are tools to enhancing that specific experience you want to have. And maybe that specific experience is horror, as feeling scared, as feeling horrified, or feeling disgusted, but maybe that experience is horror as engaging with the tropes and vibes and moods and aesthetics that you usually think of as horror. So depending on what you're going for, the mechanics are going to change, right? So that's something we're trying to tackle in Exquisite Umbras. That's something that's been on my mind a lot because, for example, take Lovecraft. Huge, obviously we got to talk about Lovecraft, right? A huge thing uh, going on for some years now is people who would make Lovecraft horrified tackling Lovecraft creations, right? Like queer people and black people, people of color. And you see that what makes them effective, what makes their stories effective, is completely different than what makes Lovecraft stories effective, right? Because what scares us is very different, right? Because Lovecraft, as a white man, had a complete different set of fears and anxieties. And the time when Lovecraft was writing also had a complete different set of anxieties too, you know. So going back, I think that mechanics can enhance your experience of horror, but they also can get in the way of your horror.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great point. Philip, I've got a couple other questions I want to whip back around for people, but any thoughts for you on what's a mechanic you've seen support horror design really well, whether that's from your own work or from someone else's work, or thoughts on what other people have said so far?
No. I actually fully agree with most of the things that everybody, this side says. I've totally forgotten which corner I am. And yeah, but Wendy just mentioned one perfect thing, and it's anxiety. And I see that people have been talking about inside the chat as well. And yes, the point of horror is to induce anxiety. Best kind of way to induce anxiety, just Jack said, some of that, I'm not sure anymore, is to create some kind of way of showing the failings, showing the inevitability, which Chris utterly fucking rocks at. No, really, I agree. Wretched is awesome. I'm personally not a fan of single-player games. I prefer a more different narrative approach. I prefer a more interwoven approach. And I myself do like, and I hate myself for this because, you all know my ideas about corporate and stuff. The Alien RPG with its stress dice. I want to just say that it's one of the few RPGs that actually piqued my interest. In my own work, I like creating stress by showing the players just how deep in crud they are by using threat, a pool. Nothing says you're screwed than a pile of black tokens in the middle of the room. But yeah, that's it. Any kind of mechanic that creates stress is good. How it's handled depends on the game. For what it's used, again, the game depends on it. Because if you're doing a short game, it requires some kind of more affectionate, grander scheme of things. Whilst when you're doing a slow burn, longer game, it has to gradually create and be accumulated.
Yeah.
So not sure how Alien will fare up for a longer game, though. Haven't played it yet.
Awesome. Some great comments in the chat. So again, lots of love for Chris's Wretched, the fact that it deals amazingly well with handling a story of grim inevitability. Like, that failure is going to be part of the end state, that things are not going to work out. Frankie, we're going to come back to your question just a little bit. I do know the Mothership RPG is doing a Kickstarter right now. We've got some great Mothership content planned for later on in the month. Lots of love for some of the stuff that Wendy was saying as well. And then Paulo says, I feel like a huge part of the appeal of horror gaming is helplessness by design, and something like Cat Elm's Vampire Next Door bakes that helplessness right in, into an otherwise lighthearted premise, just because the threat to the player characters won't be taken seriously on account of who they are, just kids. That's a mechanic at the meta level. So again, some more love for the Wretched. Also too, I think this is another. Frankie asked a great question here that I do want to chat about in just one second. But Chris, we talked a little bit about the Wretched. For people who aren't familiar with it, tell us a little bit about the Wretched. But also, I want to give you a chance to answer maybe that question about, you use the Jenga tower as a mechanic in that specifically, and a lot of people have named some of the tension that creates as a really positive mechanical experience that reinforces the narrative. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on how you kind of merge the framing that's essential in horror with some of those mechanical questions, or where you've seen that happen well.
Sam's example of Cthulhu Dark is a really good one, I think. I was going to say Trophy Dark as my answer to that question, which is just a hack of Cthulhu Dark, but it's so effective because the mechanics sort of get out of the way. Like, they're so minimal that you really could play the game without ever using them. You could just tell a story about people slowly descending into depravity and horror and their own self-indulgences without ever touching the dice if you wanted. And the dice just kind of give you a touchstone for where to land on certain story beats. Like, Trophy Dark's all about inevitable betrayal. And that's the part of the game that the dice sort of telegraph, but everything else is just kind of set dressing, and it's all left up to the players. I've already forgotten what the question was about the wretched.
It's probably because I asked you 3 questions at the same time, which is probably not helpful. Where you'd seen it done well, which is what you answered. And then a number of people have commented about the wretched specifically. And you used the Jenga tower as a mechanic in that to represent kind of this grim inevitability, and that meshed incredibly well with the framing and the thematic elements that you included to make it a horror game. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe that design choice, because it's one that's obviously resonated with a lot of people?
You're gonna hate this answer, but that design choice was literally just that I wanted to make a game with Jenga because I'd already made a game with Jenga about 2 months earlier, and I thought, yeah, I want to make another Jenga game. That was just a stroke of luck that it worked so well. But I like I've played a lot of Dread, and I really like the rising tension that a Jenga tower brings to a table. You can sit and you don't even need to touch it, and it'll wobble a bit because someone stood up too fast, and everyone kind of at the table goes, "Oh shit, don't move! The tower's going to fall. The game's going to be over." And it's also a game that you like with solo games. Like sitting rolling dice on your own can be kind of boring. Isn't inherently boring, but can be. And like, I don't know, it's something tactile to do while you play the game on your own to kind of keep you occupied, and that's super important for me because of the way my brain works. Like my ADHD needs me to be doing something with my hands all the time, and so Jenga was sort of like I wrote a game that I would want to play, and then it just happened that everybody else seemed to like it as well, you know. So Jenga was a happy accident.
Which is totally fine. I do think it's always a question of like, hey, sometimes you start with a mechanic and you're like, I love this mechanic and I want to play with it. What builds up around that? Other times you're like, here's the theme I want to build in. What mechanics reinforce that? Some people don't think about either of those things. I don't play a lot of those games, but I think it's great.
Totally throwing shade from the chair.
So, Sam, did you have anything that you wanted to add to any of those thoughts?
I do want to answer the question posed in chat.
I was about to ask that exact question. So if you want to, I mean, I'm assuming it's the one about stress, panic, sanity. Is that the one you're talking about? Why don't you go ahead and read it out and you can give us your thoughts on it?
All right. Another question: stress, panic, and sanity. Do you think they are effective at actually creating those feelings of horror? I'm assuming, or are they merely a reflection of pacing and player experience? Yes and no. I actually have very good, controversial opinion. I actually have very good experiences with Sanity Mechanics. I am aware that they are problematic, but I think under the right circumstances, let's say you're doing something like Lovecraft, right? And and as the game goes on, like players who are under more stress, who are having their sanity set, they perceive reality in a very different way. Things become altered for them. They basically forced to. They're basically the way a character in that situation might approach that situation is gets more and more fucked up the more stressed you are. With permission, with consent of your players, right? You can my good experiences using this mechanic, and with the players' consent, basically you're gaslighting the characters into seeing things that that other players don't see, or getting them to not to trust themselves. This is something that I think you should only do with the right amount, with the right people, with their consent. Safety tools, yes, definitely. But like, I think they could be implemented in that way. You know, like for example, one character is in Cthulhu Dark, for example, their sanity was getting less and less. Their stress, they're getting more and more stress, and as a result, they began to be more in touch with the spiritual realm, being more in touch with the weird. And that was a very interesting thing for the players to, as a group, to play around in that. They were trying to second guess whether that character was actually seeing what was going on, or whether or not it was just them getting to a more, whether it was a result of your stress or not. It is, again, like and it was very effective. It's been very consistently effective because helpless. Like if you can't trust yourself, you feel more helpless. And when you're feeling emotionally manipulated, it is true horror for me, at least. And yeah, like if you do manage to pull it off with the right people, by all means, just make sure everybody feels safe. Uh, but yeah, it is dangerous to do. I think.
I'd love to hear other thoughts people have about that. We recently on stream played Low Country Crawl, which is Southern U.S. Gothic horror inspired. So it's the southern half of the U.S. set in the 1900s. My character was absolutely out of a mental state. I didn't know it as a player. And we didn't set it as an off limits thing. It's just a GM I'm very comfortable with, Jeremy Gage. And so when they told me I'd been hallucinating through something post game the entire time, didn't upset me at all, because I was like, no, that's like, I made the choices I made as a player with full knowledge that I had some hints that might be the case. But I would have made those same choices had Jeremy overtly told me, hey, here's what's happening. It just like it actually piqued curiosity in me in a really solid way, because it was handled really effectively. We had done the safety work beforehand for how we were going to engage in horror. It wasn't even, I mean, it's a horror setting, but it's not it wasn't a horror game per se. We were using an OSR system to kind of crawl through a dungeon, but it was very effectively handled. And I think there's a huge capacity for how we engage in that. But do other people have thoughts on how stress, panic, or sanity mechanics enter? Wendy, go ahead.
First of all, I love that you mentioned Low Country Crawl, because I love John, one of the creators. So yeah, kisses. Another thing, I may be cheating because Frankie asked that question and we talked a lot about it. So, but I do want to chime in a little, because I'm officially insane, in that a doctor signed some paper saying that I am insane, and that, yeah. So I deal with this whole discourse around insanity mechanics in a very specific way, because when there are insanity mechanics, I usually go towards becoming insane, because that's fun for me. That's not horrifying, that's fun. And I think, going back to Trophy Dark and Cthulhu Dark, because yes, Cthulhu Dark is my favorite Cthulhu game, I love how insanity can become insight, or in Trophy Dark, ruin, or as I was talking with Frankie for Exquisite Umbras, doom. It's this accumulation of bad stuff going on, or forbidden knowledge being acquired, that, yes, surely in some games it may devolve into very problematic parodies of madness and PTSD and all kinds of boring stuff, because it's boring how it becomes this parody of real actual suffering. But when done right, I think, as I said, it's a tool to represent this descent, this narrative descent. Not like, oh, I saw an ugly monster, now I have PTSD, but oh, I've seen stuff that fucked up my understanding of the universe, and that's something that I can't just ignore. That's something that's gonna come back and bite me later. Or as Trophy Dark does with Ruin, it's a way to represent how the situation is destroying your sense of self, and then when it gets to the maximum, you lose control, you lose narrative agency, but you have one last chance to determine how that's gonna go. So yeah, I kind of like Sanity Mechanics, but with those caveats, I think.
Yeah. I love that perspective. I think it's super valuable. It actually it makes me think a lot about kind of Chris's opening statement around mechanics and some of the other stuff we've talked about. Like, what you just said about like it can be really boring when people reduce them to sheer mechanical triggers. Like, I'm not interested. I'm not interested in having mental health represented as a sheer mechanical trigger that just means like, oh, you get a -1 to some dice rolls right now. Like, that's not interesting to me at all. That's not exciting, and I don't think it's for me appropriate, right? Like, when it is a way we're choosing to engage in a narrative, and when there are mechanics that properly reinforce that, I think, and really, I think actually it's probably better to say techniques at that point. When there's techniques in play at the table that properly reinforce that, I think it's such a tremendous and interesting way to proceed as you move forward. Any other thoughts on Sanity in games? Otherwise, Jack, you have
Yeah. So I just want to sort of like parrot what you just said about, I think exploring sanity in horror games works really well when it's more about the framing, and it's like a sort of a thing that the mechanics kind of tease out of the players if they engage with it, rather than it being an actual mechanical part of a system. I think that generally works better. I also just kind of want to mention like something that I find a little bit interesting about tabletop RPGs in particular with sanity in horror is that in most other horror media, sanity isn't nearly as big a thing as it is in tabletop RPGs, which is pretty much just because, let's be honest, the big tabletop RPG is Call of Cthulhu that's horror. Like, it's the one that we have so many awesome ones otherwise. And in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot more that have kind of taken the big mantle, I think. But for a long time, Call of Cthulhu was kind of like the horror RPG, and it was the one people always mentioned first and stuff. And I think that's kind of as alongside the fact that Lovecraft in general looms large over TTRPGs as well because of his influence on stuff like D&D and things. So, but I find it kind of interesting because in a lot of horror media, sanity doesn't even come up, and the vast majority of the time when it does, it's just an excuse for a bad guy, which is just really bad and awful, but also is like kind of weird that you don't really see sanity being a factor in like the characters you're rooting for in most horror. So I think it's interesting how in TTRPGs it's become this sort of like, should horror games have it? And it's like, well, like some of them maybe, I guess. Probably not all of them.
Yeah, awesome.
I just want to touch in on that part. Most games in horror don't have sanity. Well, unless they're Lovecraftian, but let's put it aside. Actual good stuff. While I was doing research for domains, one of the things which I did as an excuse, right, was to go through every survival horror game ever made. So most of the Japanese horror games, which work mostly on the psychological level, put sanity as a backdrop, actually. Silent Hill, Resident Evil, and so on put sanity as a backdrop. Why? Silent Hill loves Silent Hill. One of the things, sanity isn't represented in the game as a meter. It is the game itself. Your character just imagines everything. Most of the game is like, yeah, poof, you just imagine that. But is it real or not? Now, that's the question. Besides that, I kind of go with what Sam said, and yes and no. It's a valid pacing thing, I think, that, as I think Frankie said that as well, it allows players to get some time to recuperate from other things. It lets you gather thoughts when you have kind of a sinusoid. Good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. You can just go from one pace to another one. It lets you also switch scenes and some other things, which I think we should delve a bit more into, because in horror, as Chris said, mechanics aren't exactly horrific. It's the scene. It's what we're telling. If we allow players to tell a horrific event, a horrific scene, they could use the mechanics to their behalf and actually tell a scene, but sometimes not. Now, that's a fine line to thread.
Well, let's switch over to kind of the other side of this coin, specifically, what are some, not like necessarily what makes things work well in horror games, or what are they, but what are a lot of the misses that we commonly see, and kind of how do you address some of those? And this could be at the table, but I think really more in design, as people are sitting down to design a horror RPG or a horror conversation or system. What are some of the things that you see people doing out there oftentimes that either don't make sense to you or you think are just misses? And I would say, as much as we were specific about the systems that did this well, we don't have to be explicit about the systems that do this poorly, unless they're a multinational, $1 million corporation, then I don't care. But if it's a small creator, you don't have to mention them by name. But things you kind of see as general misses. Let's kind of take this in reverse. Sort of, Philip, do you have any thoughts on this, specifically things that you see kind of missing?
You asked me if I have thoughts. I'm creation. I always have thoughts on everything, even if you don't want me to give input on it. But yeah, homebrewing D&D doesn't work. End of story. Done. Let's go home. No, jokes aside. I don't want to mention this person, but this specific person, which kind of holds the name as the dreaded thing that we're trying to evoke, this specific doomish feeling, which I will not name, had an early conversation with me when I started back in 2017-ish on Facebook. He's a Saurus and he's doomed. Just synonym doom for, or as Warhammer goes, in the darkness of the far future, right? Said that, horror should be splatterpunk stuff, dice go, players die. I'm going to just do a too long didn't read version, because everything he said basically is, okay, yeah, we're just looking at the graphical display of violence. How's that horrific? I think that games games have issues that they have to tell a story. If we're not telling a story, horror is specific. It works on the anxiety of the player. If you don't work into the anxiety of players, when they said it's fun. I can play a horror game and just laugh. It's not horror. Right. Why is it called a horror game then?
Awesome. Yeah. Other folks, what are some of your thoughts? Things that you see people miss on a regular basis when they're sitting down to craft a horror system or create a horror game?
So, off the back of what Philip was just saying, this is the thing I was going to say, but he pretty much just touched on it as well. My big thing would be don't be reckless with random chance. I think that's common in horror design. I think it can be a very easy, quick thing to go, oh, powerlessness is scary, therefore unpredictable outcomes, dice roll, thing happen, player die. And I think that randomness in horror, randomness in TTRPGs, I would liken to like jump scares in most other horror media. It's an effective tool that can be used to create some really awesome moments, but when it's all you've got, you just kind of disconnect from anything that's actually meaningful. And I think part of it factors into the story thing as well, of horror games don't often work well when they're long form. They tend to be better as like few sessions, one session games, just because I think horror fatigues and you get used to it, and there's ways to do it, but generalizing, they work better as smaller games, which means that you don't have the chance to really get invested in your character in the way that you would in a multi-year campaign, which means that the risk of randomly losing them from like a bad dice roll, or from them like it's just something random happening, is I think when you're working with those short time scales, it just acts to disconnect people from ever connecting to the character. They often just sort of like put up that barrier as a bit of a protection. Whereas if you've got some sort of like plausible predictability with an element of randomness in it, rather than just full hard, the dice decide everything randomness, it plays a little bit better into the whole kind of like failures become like an unexpected trip up or a difficult situation to overcome, rather than just kind of like, well, we roll the dice and we see what happens, which I think can disconnect people. There are ways to use it. That's why I say don't use randomness recklessly, rather than don't use it. Like, it has.
This is one of the reasons that I think that the more mechanics you layer onto a game, the less likelihood you have of making a successful horror experience, because horror and fear are something that are felt by players, not the characters. And the more mechanics and things you layer onto it, the more character you put into a game, the more of a barrier there is between the player and the game itself. Like, and this is why I think that games that aren't explicitly horror games are often the most effective horror games. Like Sam's Wet Cigarette is one of the most harrowing games I've ever played in my life. And it's not explicitly a horror game, but it blurs the lines between fiction and reality, and you delve into these experiences between you and one other player where you're bringing up things, and you're bringing up, there's a very real danger that you're bringing up very real wounds between these two people, and it blurs that line of what is fiction and what is real, and it left me feeling deeply, deeply uncomfortable when I finished playing it. And that's not an experience I've ever had from a horror game. And so, like, if we come back to the question, what do games do wrong? I think trying to be scary is often the thing that a game gets wrong the most, or at least trying to be scary in a non-specific way. I think the most effective horror games are very focused down onto one specific kind of fear, and they put that fear in the players, and then they leave you with it. Like how the most effective horror novels and films aren't necessarily scary while you're watching them. They're scary 4 hours later when you can't stop thinking about it.
French horror.
That would be my answer anyway.
Or the next time you engage with the mundane thing that story featured around that became absolutely terrifying, you can't take a shower that night. Like, you have to check under your bed, right? Like, you go to do your taxes and have an existential crisis, whatever it happens to be, right? Like, those are, absolutely some of the ones that stick with you are the best. Sam, how any thoughts on that? Oh, Wendy, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, Wendy, go ahead.
I just really want to quickly add something in to what Chris said, because it's really, really good. Sorry. There's an interesting thing that I've noticed in a lot of horror media, where some of the scariest experiences you'll have are spooky bits of non-spooky things. And I think that plays into like the whole unexpected kind of like take your guard down. But I do think that becomes a bit of a different thing than actual horror media in a lot of ways. Like, some of the scariest TV episodes are from Doctor Who, which isn't a horror series, but it does some good horror episodes. But if the whole series was horror, it probably wouldn't be that scary. I just wanted to drop that in off the back of what Chris said. Sorry, Wendy. Please go.
I do want to add on. Sorry, go. Okay. I do want to add on in response to one of the questions about Midnight Mass, right? Like, is it scary? Is it actual scary horror, or is it something else? I think building off to what everybody's talking about, the reason why I think Midnight Mass works for me is because the non-scary parts of the show are the most scary parts, because they are the parts of the show which hit me personally as someone with religious experience, as someone who is still considers themselves a person of faith, right? That the lines of logic the characters go through and the things which happen and things they struggle with, right? That is the most disturbing part of Midnight Mass, because of how close home it hits for the people who watch it, who have been through that experience.
Midnight Mass is amazing. Go ahead, Wendy.
Yeah, that goes with what I was gonna say. That is, I think the worst thing one could do with horror is treat it as some kind of one-size-fits-all thing. Like, there's no human concept of horror. Horror is deeply personal. Something that scares me is not going to scare you. And, like, for example, death is not shouldn't be the scary thing in horror games, I think, because if you die in a game, you're just gonna roll another character or just watch while the game ends or something, there are worse things than death, anyways. And that goes to what they were saying before. But that's exactly the kind of question me and Frankie are trying to answer in our exquisite Umbrus game, because we're trying to understand what's scary for us and how can we put that on paper. How can we convey what's scary for us, and hopefully we can bring our feeling of being scared to the players. We're not gonna be able to predict what's gonna scare the players. We're not gonna be able to predict what's gonna be scary with capital S. For example, people always say that powerlessness is what makes horror effective, or that the lack of control or insanity. But that's not gonna just work out of the box. You know, horror is only scary when it speaks to personal fears. So what I think is an answer to that is that you can put people in your shoes and make them understand how you feel. So what's scary for you makes sense to them as being scary. That makes sense?
I love that. No, thinking about when you're doing the design work or when you do the framing work, how you communicate the specific type of thing that you're afraid of, rather than having this kind of generic, it's spooky layer on top. I think is huge. Yeah, that's awesome.
I want to touch up on this because that's actually awesome, the whole empathizing thing, because I'm going to put a little contraposo here. Basically, I didn't design a game where I'm trying to scare anybody. It's a game where players tell a story about their characters being scared. And hopefully, bleed takes over. They empathize with the characters and get on train with their fears. So, yeah, the question is, are we trying to scare the players by doing, as Jack said, jump scares, or trying to make people feel what's the scary part of it? So I'm not sure if the main thing of games, which I really detest, what most games try to do, is try to scare the player. Why? Is that scary? I think that making the player empathize with the character being scared is maybe, just maybe, better.
Yeah, I love that. Other thoughts on that?
I mean, I'll probably second that. It's pretty much the approach that Locust took. It's the way we went through it, which I think probably has a lot to do with the media that inspired us, because Philip mentioned Silent Hill earlier. Silent Hill was one of the big influences on Locust as well. There's probably something there as a sort of correlation, but I think that you can do both styles. But I think that from a mechanics design point of view, it is common to see mechanics that are designed to scare the player rather than mechanics that are designed to help you empathize with the character, which might be a really good way to do horror. Yeah.
Well, and I think
Hopefully.
I think it also brings up a big question of like, what is the intent of your game? Like, because I think both of those are valid choices to be making when you're designing horror. I think if, as a designer, you want to be clear about which of those choices am I making when I sit down to make this game, right? Like Bluebeard's Bride specifically has the mechanical, the move Shiver, right, which is triggered when the player becomes scared of something. I also do wonder if there's some level of, and I would love at some point in the future to tease out, because there's probably a deeper thread there on the way that players come to the table to play their character that absolutely matters there, right? Like, and we'll have a little bit of a chance to talk about that in just 1 second. But when we design games with one of those choices in mind, either we want to scare the player or we want them to empathize with the character who's being scared, I think we're starting to talk a little bit more about how do we view people typically as sitting down and playing their character and engaging in that mode of play, and then how do we ask them to make specific choices? And I think it is one of the reasons why sometimes I'll sit down to play a horror game and it's just laughs and giggles the entire time, even though we're dealing with horrific stuff. Whereas other times, even if it's not a horror game, it can be like the only time I've ever experienced anxiety in play, like significant anxiety, like I started making bad choices because I was responding in an anxious way, was when Sam Sorensen ran Low Lives for us, which is about caving, and I'm not a huge fan of tight spaces underground and getting trapped in them. I don't like that idea. It's not something I think about, and I've gone into doing some light caving before. But if you were ever like, as a big guy, the concept of can I squeeze this small space or am I going to get stuck speaks to me in a very specific way. And Sam literally almost like terrified me with pretty normal ass fire ants after the fact. Like I'd gotten stuck in a hole. I, as a player, experienced anxiety because of that. Now he pressed that, and I was totally still making choices in a player standpoint. But I, as a character standpoint, but I, as a player, couldn't think as clearly because of the anxiety I just experienced. And as a GM, Sam was playing across that line incredibly well, and is also a very gifted GM too. And Low Life is, if you like caving in your OSR stuff, great thing to go check out. But I think that takes us to another like our kind of last big question, and that's what does this look like at the table? Because we've already talked a lot about a big part of designing for horror or horror games specifically is not so much about the mechanics we choose or just framing and theme and all those things being important on our side, but actually what happens at the table. So I think we'd actually be really remiss if we talked about horror RPGs and even designing them without talking about play state. Like, what does it look like when we actually sit down at the table to play and engage in these games? And so in just a second, we're going to kind of dive in to talking about that. I want to get us caught up on the chat real quick. Some great conversations about Midnight Mass and the fact that whatever Sam says about Midnight Mass is 100% canonically accurate and should always be listened to. Frankie also brings up there's nothing to write. It's a quote. There's nothing to writing. All you have to do is sit down at the typewriter and bleed. Frankie thinks this applies double to horror. I think that's such a great piece of insight. Kat says, if I may ask a question, please. I've had the best fear from players when I ran a false Hydra in 5e because I was changing the story around them, and they knew it. How do you think meta plays into horror RPGs? I think this is part of that same conversation we're about to dive into. So I don't know how often y'all sit down to run horror games for groups. Some of you maybe more or less than others, but I'd love to talk about that a little bit specifically from a designer perspective, how you approach that. And where that kind of ends up. Philip, it looks like you've got some thoughts. Sam has also run some very non-horror games in some excellent horror ways for us on stream before, so I absolutely want to hear some of Sam's thoughts on this too. But Philip, go ahead.
Sorry for this. Meta. Basically, meta is important. I really think that all the players should be aware that meta is important in horror. Why? Compared to other games, we're playing kind of, let's say, OSR style, GM versus the players. In horror, it's basically players with players with players with players with the GM. You're working on a meta level. You have to be aware that this isn't only a game. You have to be willing to be scared. That's one of the things which I explain to my players. First and foremost, how I design and run games, as that's the theme. That willingness to be scared comes from a meta level, where you understand that the rules work towards that. But you need a safe environment to do so, because most people don't like being scared, don't like giving themselves over to fear. So safety tools. And once that is done, just try to invoke that fear through meta play. Basically make the whole game revolve around 1, 2, maximum 3 mechanics you're using, and make sure those mechanics work towards making fear. Players should be aware that their choices are going to create more of that mechanic, and let's call it that way. That's how I design my own game. I mean, basically going towards that the players themselves are willing and actually aware that the trope, go into the dark place over there, do stuff, monster will pop out. Yeah, that's the most balanced horror ever, but they should be aware that they're doing that they're willing to do that, they're willing to embrace that, a willing suspension of disbelief. That is going to happen in the story. That's okay. We're all okay with that. That's basically it. I think that's the whole idea of designing horror.
Sam, do you have any thoughts on PlayState running horror, or how we kind of create this good space to play horror in?
I do want to build on what Philip has said, because I'm reminded of part of the fun of watching horror is going with it with the expectation that something will happen. I like jump scares. And like the fun part about jump scares is that you know it's gonna happen. It's very easy to know when it's gonna happen. It's just fun to go in and go like, oh shit, that is just right around the corner. It's the same reason while watching like certain disturbing movies, right? You're not going in, to be surprised. You know exactly what to expect. It's just when the shit pops up, you get the rush. You know what I mean? I think metagaming, hell yeah, like if players are like, let me be scared, then yeah, by all means, like if they want to be gaslit or lied to or manipulated, if they consent to that, that's great. If that's what you want to do, yeah.
Awesome. Anybody else thoughts on on when you sit down to play, how we do some of that technique, some of that framing, how we move from just here's the book, the game that we wrote, into the actual play state, and that could be from a design perspective, how you help GMs or players do that, or it could be just from a sheer play perspective.
Yeah, so I think horror is the genre that I ran the most games in, and because I don't usually run games because I get too much anxiety, but as I love horror, I can channel that to the game. So I've ran lots of horror games, and first of all, I think what Sam said about jump scares is perfect. I think jump scares are kind of like when you're listening to Pink Floyd and you are getting to that moment where you have that huge guitar solo, but you gotta build to that, right? And you anticipate it, and that then comes the jump scare as a kind of release, and you if you only had the release, the release wouldn't release you from anything, right? So you gotta build up to that. About meta, I think my most successful game, horror game that I ran, was about it kind of mixed Robert Johnson's story about making a deal with the devil at the crossroads and haunted album and stuff like that with Cthulhu mythos, and I leaned hard on the meta part to the point where I kind of gaslit my players, where I said stuff and then pretended I haven't said that, or I actually recorded a song and then distorted it and played it for them because they found this vinyl and they played it, and I had like different sound files. Whenever they played it again, it would get more and more distorted, and it actually gave one of my players nightmares because they weren't expecting it. They got gaslit. But that brings me the biggest thing, I think, is that horror shouldn't be safe. But for that to be doable, you have to have a safe space for that, right? Horror can be a tool for even dealing with your own traumas and fears and anxieties. I think it's one of the most effective genres for that because it gives you a kind of embodied experience, sometimes literally visceral experience, right? But for that, you have to trust your table, you have to trust each other, and you have to know which boundaries shouldn't be crossed. So horror shouldn't be safe, but safety tools and a safe space is of the utmost importance to that. So people will be comfortable to letting go and letting themselves get into this unsafe space for them, you know.
I think that's a key also, like some language there stuff there. Like I think the difference between like safety and trust like is implicit. Like trust comes into play when we're in an inherently unsafe place, right? Like if we're all safe, I don't have to trust that the GM how the GM is running the game or anything else like that. And I do think that's such a key differentiation. Lots of times when we talk about toolkits, specifically like safety toolkits, those are designed to build trust. The goal is safe play, but underneath a certain set of circumstances. The goal is to create the space for actual trust and especially intimacy, I think, in horror to grow, because so much of good horror experiences come out of carnality. They come out of knowing the person specifically. They come out of the individualized response of seeing somebody and knowing how to respond to them. Now, you're inverting some of that, but you're inverting it in a way that you've said, hey, like, I trust you in a way that I desire this specific type of experience from you in this moment, and we're all entering into that together. And that happens specifically when we either A, have a long established play culture, or B, have done the work to build that trust, which toolkits can help with tremendously. And as I think about it, like I like, you know, line spells and the X card are so simple, but so common, which I love, and it's what we primarily use on stream. I don't know that I think they are sufficient for this, though I think they are good tools. I love things like the script change mechanics, specifically looking at what you do before the setting and giving people a little bit more of a robust tool set once you're in there. And specifically talking about ahead of time, what are the places that I do desire to get scared in, or where do I get scared as a player? Because that is an entry point into then triggering empathy when you see a character, yours or somebody else's, in peril in that way. Like basically, where do we want to go forward? Like what are the places we want to move forward into, not just the places we want to avoid. And I think script change does that in such a really phenomenal way. And I mean, I'd be curious if anybody, I mean, I think Cats is helpful. I think there's tons of other helpful tools out there for that kind of stuff. But I think we have to specifically ask some additional questions when we're talking about the horror genre, specifically the horror state of play. Chris, any thoughts on running horror, sitting down, being engaged in that place? And I know you talked a lot early about this is really where horror takes place, is when you're sitting around a table together. Share a couple thoughts on this.
I mean, honestly, like Wendy and Sam kind of covered everything I was going to say. I think it's really interesting that Wendy says she runs horror more than anything else, because I probably run horror the least, or at least run it for people I don't know the least, because like you said, it's all about trust and intimacy and being able to make yourself vulnerable with people in a way that I can't do with strangers. For me, there's a lot of crossover between horror and kind of games and media about sex, because it's all about intimacy and trust. And when you come to safety tools and things, it's not just about, say, like you touched on, Tony, it's not just about saying this is what I don't want to touch on. It's about affirmative safety tools and giving like affirmative consent to say, like, this is what scares me, this is what I want to explore, and even if it is scaring me and I'm upset, I want you to keep pushing that point. And that's why we have tools like the X card for in play, so you can say, actually, this has gone too far now. But if you set up the experience beforehand and say, this is where we want to go and we're going to hit it hard, you create a space where you're not worried about going too far. You're not worried about crossing lines, because you've had that very frank conversation up front beforehand. I think one thing that's really important for games like this, for any game, there's almost a sense of creating like a ritual space. You know, you don't just come to the table and sit down and start playing. You go through, you have a chat with your friends, you dim the lights, you put some music on, you know, have some snacks, and then you say, right, we're playing the game. And you set up that space that's ready to play. I think it's equally as important to have a, to end the ritual, to have like a decompression at the end and say, like, we are done now, and we're going to maybe talk about it or decompress or have a debrief or whatever we need to do to draw a line under that experience and make sure that everyone goes away from it in a healthy way, especially if it's been a really intense game or an intense session.
You have to
because it's fun to be scared, it's not fun to be traumatized. You know,
I'm a huge fan of rituals of play. So I mean I love that. I love when any game has a here's what you do to know you started playing, here's what you do to know you've ended playing. And those can be sometimes very procedural, but I think not enough games consider the actual decompress standpoint for how do we actually have a conversation after this that helps us in this and transition into the new space. And so like I 100% love that. And people are asking about props specifically. I think that addresses some of that. And we've hit some of that along the way. Like Wendy, I love hearing about the slowly distorting music that not even your players are sure did they hear it. Like, that's such a phenomenal technique if the GM has it in their tool belt, or even if you're a designer out there, these are things to think about, and you have these capabilities. Like Chris is a phenomenal musician. Chris has the ability to do that, and so it's something to think that not that Chris has to do this, but it's something that people can think about when they're designing games if they have those toolkits.
Certain music game when?
Yeah, or if you're developing a game and crowdfunding and other things, thinking about how you want to include some of those elements that you can give to GMs and players to be able to run them. And there's a lot of really great things that can be explored in that area. I know I missed a few questions as we were going through, so if people have more questions, more comments, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We've just got about 10 minutes left. Did somebody just want to make a comment?
Yeah, I wanna first. You don't gotta be Chris because Chris is a rock star, right? So just do what you can.
Literally, Chris is a rock star. That's not a hyperbolic statement.
But I want to give 2 examples, but I want to give a trigger warning first for sexual assault and stuff, because I want to contrast the most horrific in a bad way experience I've had with some of the best horror experience I've had. Because when I started playing, I had this friends group and there was trust, and the most horrific stuff that happened to me was when the trust was betrayed when I wasn't expecting. Like when, yes, I played Cthulhu Tech. Don't do that. But I did. I was a teenager, and one of the thing about Cthulhu Tech is that rape is something that is written in the book as part of the setting. So the person who was running it felt comfortable to use that with my character in a way that I wasn't expecting, and that was horrific, like literally horror. But that wasn't a good horror experience because that didn't manage to help me deal with my feelings about the subject. On the contrary, it exploited them. That's something that you got to keep in mind. You don't want to exploit people's fears. And same thing. I am horribly arachnophobic. Before I knew about lines and veils and all this stuff, I my friends knew I was arachnophobic, and one very recurring cliche was to throw giant spiders at me, because that would make me horrified. But it was not a good way to make me horrified, because that actually brought me out of the game, because that was something that they knew as my friends, not as something that my character feared, right? So with lines and veils, I can say that, oh, please no huge spiders, and that's okay. There are like Sean Smith, a friend of mine, British, like Chris and Jack. He is like my go-to Cthulhu guy, and he was gonna run a game with spiders, and I told him that I was afraid of spiders, and he changed it to giant scorpions, and the fear was the same,
Right.
you know. And I think the most horrific game I've played was actually playtesting my next game with Frankie running it, because Frankie knew what I was afraid of. And actually, that was a scenario that I've written. And even if I knew what was going to happen, that scared me, because Frankie explored that not as exploitation, but as something to deal with.
Yeah.
That for me is the key. You don't want to exploit the fear. You want to explore the fear.
Yeah.
You know.
I love that. We love Sean. Actually, Sean ran Treasures of the Troll King for us on one of the most cursed streams we've ever had technology-wise, but worked out incredibly well for the themes. But I remember Chris at one point commenting about, like, did I write that thing that horrible? When Sean was writing it, I was like, oh no, I made it worse. And so
Sean's great.
But Frankie has a great observation, and I think it's absolutely valid, so I want to make sure we mention it. It's interesting to hear that intimate games are harder with strangers. I find it's a lot easier to bear oneself with people you don't know because they don't know about what you are bearing. If you're playing with friends, it magnifies the intimacy to me because they actually catch things. I think that can absolutely be a factor. I think there's a lot of things that come into play, but I also think, the intimacy of strangers who will never do a thing together again, meeting in the night to do something together one time, is a beautiful type of intimacy that is different and distinct, and maybe more comfortable for some people than others, and that's absolutely valid.
And that comes back to what we talked about at the top of the show, right? Which is that horror is deeply personal and it's different for everyone else, and that's what makes it so hard to write good, effective horror.
Right.
Yep.
And what's great horror for me might not be great for Sam or Wendy or anybody else, you know?
Yeah. And then Bidgie said, I enjoy reading through my copy of Sam's Capitalities, lots of reminders of home. And everybody loves Sean. Bert says,
I love Sean.
Who doesn't love Sean? I love the way that safety tools are written into The Hunted by Chris as part of the ritual of play that they mentioned. Just another note there. So, Chris, can you tell people a little bit about the way that you kind of included things in Hunted and what that looked like?
No, because I don't remember what's
That's
in
fine.
that game. I'm really sorry.
That's fine. Go buy a copy of The Hunted, folks. I'll look up a link for you real quick.
I'll second that. Buy it. It's great.
Bye.
And you can see for yourself exactly how it works. No, I think there's
me know as well because I don't remember.
There's a lot. There's a ton of things we could explore in this area, but we're coming up right on an hour and a half. If you got another question, drop it in. We may have time for one or two more after we kind of do some of our end cap stuff here. But I do want to come back a little bit. Thank every single one of you. It's been so great to have you on. Some of you, Sam and Chris, I've got to interact with a lot before. Wendy, I know we're going to be spending some more time together this month. Super excited about it. Philip, I've been a fan of your work. Jack, you too. So excited to have you on. Always exciting to sit down and have these conversations. If you're in the chat right now, if you're watching this later even and you're making comments, we host these as community conversations. Like, we don't really host them as here's our hour and a half long panel. I love seeing what other folks' thoughts are. So just because you're not somebody whose face made it up here, we saw people like Kat's design getting mentioned in the chat, which is a phenomenal example of why it's so important for us to be having these dialogues, even if some people are on screen and some people are in the chat, as a total community. And I hope that you can encourage to have these in a more nuanced way than just like, hey, I think this is a spooky mechanic and I don't think mechanics are spooky, and just tweeting at each other back and forth and never going anywhere. Teasing those things out, because that's horror for me. Teasing those things out absolutely matter. One of my thoughts, as we were kind of talking through this last section that I kept on coming back to in experiential education, we'll talk a lot about the difference between somebody's comfort zone, their challenge zone, and their panic zone. Experiential education is oftentimes about some sort of human or group development. And the goal is always like, how do we get people to step outside of their very small comfort zone into what's probably their very wide challenge zone without going into their panic zone? And I think good horror plays in the far end of that challenge zone. But I think we see groups grow and shift and encounter new things, both as individuals and as a table community, when we're able to engage in horror in a meaningful way. And I think it's one of the reasons it's sometimes very great to throw a group together and just see how that works out if everybody's committed to that. And I think it's sometimes why we need that space of intimacy to be able to explore that. And everywhere in between is that everybody has a different space where their challenge zone occupies or where their panic zone might be met. And I think that's a huge part of that. So it's something that we talk about a lot as we think about sequencing, about how we ask people to engage safely in risk and other things like that when we're doing experiential education. And so it's something that just kept on coming up over and over again. during this last segment. So if you've never checked it out, it's a whole branch of games and play that I absolutely love and is core to how I started designing. I'd always encourage people to go look up some more experiential education stuff because it's super informative for a lot of RPG design also too. With that said, I want to let's go ahead and hear from Philip. Philip, tell people who you are, where they can find you online if they want to know more about your stuff.
Well, who I am, I'm Philip. Easy as that. They can find me on Twitter mostly. I'm also on Discord if anybody, by any chance, I don't know why, wants to join my Discord, they're welcome. And on itch.io, I mostly design stuff that I want to play. One of them was Domains, a horror game that I wanted to play because I didn't find horror at that moment, which did exactly that. Thank you, Balkan Bubble. But yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. Let's hear next from Jack. Jack, tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online.
Yeah, cool. Hi, I'm Jack Milton. I'm the sort of freelance creative game designer, but I'm also half of Cobblepath Games. The main thing we've done is Locus, which is a psychological horror mystery game. And you can find us at cobblepathgames.co.uk or on Twitter at Cobblepath, or I'm at Cobblesprite.
Awesome. Let's hear from Sam next.
Hi, my name is Sam. I'm a role-playing game designer, a copy editor, creative writer. I do a lot of horror stuff. I do a lot of intimacy stuff. Do hire me to do creative stuff and technical stuff for your games and your writing. I am also now a coder, a freshly minted coder. Not an NFT references. I do not support NFTs. That, and I'm also a musician. So if you want to hire me for like anything, oh yeah, I'm also into shibari, which is like rope bondage. So like if you want me to do anything with that, I'm your guy. Depending on the time of day. No, really, someone's actually interested in hiring me to do shibari now. You can find me on Babblegum Sam, which is like bubblegum but with an A instead of a U. Babblegum. I've actually just published, as we were doing the panel, I was brushing up, and I just published a horror game called Horse Girl, inspired by Tusk, the Human Centipede trilogy, Boxing Helena, and Equus. It is my attempt. I'm not going to explain it, but it is quite I try my best at making a fucked up torture exploitation game, but I won't say anything more than that. Go do check out Horse Girl. I'll post it on chat.
I got it. I got it because you can't post links. But
oh shit!
It's in there.
Okay, it's there. Very cool. So go check out Horse Girl. It's exactly what you think it is.
It looks like you posted something really rude.
It does. It's just to keep the spammer links out of our chat and keep everyone. It's one of our safety tools. That said, I do want to say we've got two people on who are part of active Kickstarters right now. We're going to go in reverse order the way that we went to the top. So, Wendy, tell us a little bit more about the RPG LatAm Breakout.
Yeah, so LatAm Breakout is a collection of 5 games, 5 very distinct games from 5 very distinct Latin American designers. Please check it out. Please back it. It's reparations if you're white. It's reparations if you're cis, and it's reparations if you're from the global north. So please back it. Give us money so we can keep on making awesome games together. My game specifically is here. There be monsters with commas and exclamation point that touches a lot on everything we talked about here. But it's funny because I didn't write it nor designed it with it being a horror game in my mind. It was supposed to be first and foremost love letter / response middle finger to monster hunting media of all kinds. But some people, actually a lot of people, found it deliciously horrifying. So I don't know. It's about the monsters and monstrosity as something to be protected and cherished, and yeah, and it's about being a monster myself, and not just by being queer, everyone that doesn't fit what's normal can identify as a monster, and that's basically what I'm going for here. It's about monstrosity and trying to erase monstrosity, trying to make it normal, trying to capitalize on that too. And how we can resist, how we can fight back, basically. So, and yeah, that's not horror for me. That's the opposite of it. But I can see why us monsters can be horrifying for the system and for normality. On the other hand, I have next game coming next year with Frankie that what is on the chat with us, and keep posted because that one is going to be actually full on horror 100%. You can find me with my link, my card page, wendyu.card with .co without the M. And please, again, let's break out, not just for me, but for the whole group of 5 awesome people. And Zach and Matt from So Muppet are awesome. And Sam is my editor too. So yeah.
Awesome. Love it.
Oh, and also I'm a writer and a designer, and I also do sensitivity reading with queer stuff in mind and global south stuff in mind. So please hire me because I need money because Bolsonaro is my president.
Awesome. And when he's going to be back on chatting with us and hopefully playing with us later on this month, the Thursday or the Friday after Thanksgiving in the U.S., or just whatever the fourth Friday of the month is here for our Exalted Funeral show that we do every month. So I'm super excited to be able to sit back down with you a little bit and chat some more about all those amazing things. And then last but certainly not least, we have Chris Bissett. Chris, tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online, but also tell us again about, I'm going to mispronounce it, Down in Yongardy.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Chris Bissett. You can find me on Twitter at Pangalactic. I'm just very quickly going to go on record that I agree with Sam that Tusk is the best A24 film. And I'm really glad that she finally made a game based on it, or inspired by it. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I've got a website called Loot the Room, loottheroom.uk. And I'm currently kickstarting Down in Yongardy, which is a solo game book inspired by the fighting fantasy books that I grew up with, that uses the setting and mechanics of Troika. You play a newly qualified Yongardy lawyer who everything goes horribly wrong for, and it's just like a madcap adventure inspired by Troika and Kafka's The Trial and the chaos inside my head. And
Awesome.
It's funded, and we're headed towards a stretch goal for an alternate cover by Gontijo, who is an amazing Brazilian graphic designer. Words, I can't do them.
All the things.
It's late and I need to eat. Yeah. Please throw money at that and throw money at Breakout as well, because everyone involved in that project is awesome and it's going to be amazing. And throw money at Zedek, who launched a Kickstarter today as well, because holy shit, Thousand Islands sucks. Like, it's so good.
We've got Zedek on playing the first adventure in the anthology with us at the end of the month. I'm super excited to sit down and play.
Those zines are the best thing on my shelf, and I cannot wait for Reach of the Rose God. It's going to be so good.
Yeah. There's a ton of amazing things happening right now. Please go check them out. We are going to be off for a lot of this week. I'm going to do, I think, a back request late in the day tomorrow. On Sunday night, they were sitting down with Keegan EXC and playing their Dungeon Delver TV RPG that's in development right now. It's based on Down We Go, which is our house OSR system, but it's a post-dungeon future fantasy dungeon crawler that I am super excited to be able to play. Keegan does some absolutely phenomenal stuff. Yeah, if you are a designer and you ever want to, if you like, it's pretty easy. If you ever want to do a panel with us or anything else like that, come on for an interview, please let me know. Just reach out to us. If you want to help support our channel, the best way to do that is to head over to our Ko-fi page, kofi.com/+1exp. There are links in all the places where you might be watching this to that directly. Become a content champion. If you're a designer and you'd like us to ever feature one of your games, feel free to reach out about that also too. Chris, I can't wait to hear about the total process of writing this book from you also too. Once it's all done, I'd love to have you back on specifically to talk about, hey, you wrote an actual book that had multiple branching pathways, and I want to know how your brain did that at some
Yeah,
point in
absolutely.
time. So I'm super excited about all the different things that are going up. Some super phenomenal Kickstarters right now. But thanks everybody who showed up for this community conversation. If you're watching later, just please know that you are a part of the community also too. And that can sound like an incredibly trite, simple thing to say that's just for the likes. So if you feel that way, that's okay. But the best way to make that not the case is to actually engage. So if you have comments, if you have thoughts, if you agree, if you disagree, charitably engage down in the comments section below. We'd love to dialogue with you about that and enter some actual online community with you too, so that it's not just a weird passing statement that we make in parasocial ways. It'll still be parasocial, but not quite as toxic. So with all that said, until the next time we host one of these, thank you so much everybody who came on today and for everybody who participated with us. We will see you next time. Bye everybody.
Bye, Bok.